Today, we are diving into a landmark decision from India's Supreme Court that's, well, about as complex as it gets, the Nagaraj case. And this is so much more than just a legal ruling. It's really the story of a nation trying to balance the heavy scales of historical justice with the promise of future equality, all within the pages of its constitution. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the big question of equality that's right at the heart of this case. Then we'll look at the specific laws that were put on trial. We're going to unpack the three critical conditions the court laid down, make sense of the very nuanced verdict, and see the incredible balancing act it performed. And finally, we'll talk about why the Nagaraj legacy is still so important in India today. At its core, the Nagaraj case tackles this huge problem. How do you fix the injustices of the past without creating unfairness in the present? That's exactly what the Supreme Court was asked to figure out, with the Constitution as its only roadmap. And this one question, this was the engine for the entire legal battle. Now, lots of countries struggle with this, for sure. But in India, the deep history of the caste system gives this question a unique and, honestly, a profound urgency. And just to be super clear here, the debate wasn't just about getting a foot in the door for a job. No. It was about what happens next. The real issue was affirmative action in promotions. Basically, should members of these historically marginalized groups, the scheduled castes and tribes, get a reserved path up the career ladder in government jobs? So to make these reservations and promotions a reality, the Indian Parliament actually went ahead and passed a bunch of constitutional amendments. But the big question was, were those amendments themselves even constitutional? And that's what brought the whole thing to the Supreme Court. And here it is. The case that landed on the Supreme Court's desk was M. Nagaraj and others versus the Union of India. This 2006 judgment, which is our main source for this entire explainer, is where the court finally laid down the law on this really contentious issue. So there were 4 specific constitutional amendments under the microscope. Over a few years, Parliament had passed these to basically create legal workarounds to earlier court rulings that had put limits on reservations. They were designed to make these promotions legally bulletproof. But the question remained, did Parliament go too far? So what did the court do? What was its solution? Well, it didn't just give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to Parliament's amendments. Instead, it did something much smarter. It basically built a cage around them. It set up this really strict set of conditions that the government has to meet before it can ever use the power these amendments give it. This quote from the judgment is absolutely crucial. The court made it crystal clear that providing these reservations isn't something the government has to do. It's a choice. It's an option. And this is the key part. If the government decides to use that option, it has to back it up with hard evidence. And this right here, this is that framework, the famous 3-part test. For any reservation and promotions to be valid, the government has to clear 3 hurdles. First, it needs cold, hard data to prove a community is still backward today. Second, it has to show that this community isn't properly represented in that specific type of government job. And third, it must prove that the reservation won't hurt the overall efficiency of how the government runs. So, the final verdict was this brilliant piece of legal tightrope walking. The court said, okay, yes, the amendments Parliament passed are technically valid, but, and this is a huge but, it attached those heavy strings of that 3-part test, which completely changed how and even if they could ever be used. Now, to get to this decision, the court pulled out a really powerful legal tool called the Basic Structure Doctrine. It's this uniquely Indian idea that says, look, Parliament can amend the Constitution, but it can't destroy its core soul, things like fundamental rights. The court decided that while these amendments definitely pushed the limits, they didn't completely break that core structure. And this is maybe the single biggest takeaway on the verdict. The court called these amendments enabling provisions. Think of it like this. Parliament built a really powerful machine, but the Nagaraj judgment wrote the mandatory safety manual. The government can't just walk up and flip the switch. It has to run a full diagnostic check every single time. So when you boil it all down, this entire judgment was a high-wire balancing act. The court was forced to weigh these competing and equally important constitutional values against each other.
And right here, this is the tension baked into the Constitution itself. On one side, you have Article 16.1, which promises equal opportunity for every single individual. And on the other, you have these provisions that allow for special treatment for entire groups to fix historical injustices. Nagaraj was all about forcing these two incredibly powerful ideas to find a way to coexist.
The court also really hammered home this idea of the creamy layer. The thinking here is that even within a disadvantaged community, the folks who have become socially and economically well off should be excluded from getting reservation benefits. It's basically a filter to make sure the policy actually helps the people who need it most, not those who've already climbed the ladder.
So you can really see the court was trying to juggle these three massive constitutional values: equity for disadvantaged groups, justice for past wrongs, and efficiency in government. That three-part test wasn't just a random set of rules. It was the court's formula for trying to keep all three of these things in a very fragile balance.
And the court also put its foot down on a critical red line, the 50% ceiling. This is a long-standing rule that says total reservations can't be more than half of all the available jobs. It's there to make sure that affirmative action stays as an exception to the rule of equal opportunity, not the other way around.
So what's the lasting impact here? I mean, why are we still talking about a case from 2006? Well, the answer is in the powerful, data-driven framework it created for the future.
Before Nagaraj, reservation policies could get by on broad historical arguments. But after Nagaraj, not anymore. The game completely changed. Now, the government has to defend every single reservation policy with cold, hard, contemporary data. The court basically dragged the entire foundation of affirmative action from the past into the present, demanding evidence over belief.
And there's this really powerful quote from the judgment that kind of reveals the court's biggest fear. It saw reservation not as a permanent solution, but as a kind of potent medicine, absolutely necessary in some cases, but really dangerous if you get the dose wrong or use it for too long. It worried that it could end up making the disease of casteism it was meant to cure even worse.
And that leaves us with the final nagging question that hangs over everything. By making data the new bedrock of affirmative action, the Nagaraj judgment solved one problem, but, it kind of created a new one, because data has to be interpreted. So who gets to decide what inadequate representation actually looks like on a spreadsheet? And who has the final say when a community is no longer backward? The Nagaraj case might be closed, but for India, the balancing act goes on.